Story 1. Valdez plane crash. Survivors who heard someone calling. The voice on the emergency radio was not one of ours, and the footprints in the snow led away from the crash site, not toward it. My name is James Mercer. I am a bush pilot with 18 years of experience flying the Alaskan wilderness. I have navigated through whiteout conditions, landed on glaciers, and brought supplies to communities so remote they cannot be reached by road. I thought I understood fear. I thought I knew what danger looked like. Then our plane went down in the Chugach Mountains northeast of Valdez on February 9th, and I learned that some things in the darkness are far more terrifying than any mechanical failure or weather condition I had ever faced. There were 6 of us on that flight. Myself, my co-pilot Sarah Chen, 4 passengers heading to a mining survey site. The forecast showed clear conditions. Flight time estimated at 42 minutes. It should have been routine. Easy. The kind of run I had made hundreds of times before. The engine failed at 11,000 feet. No warning, no stuttering, just sudden, horrifying silence where the reliable hum of the propeller had been. We dropped like a stone into a valley so remote it did not even have a name on the maps. Just coordinates, just endless white wilderness stretching in every direction. I managed to level us out enough that the crash was survivable. Barely. We hit hard, the left wing tore off. The fuselage crumpled, but we were alive, all 6 of us, injured but conscious. Trapped in twisted metal surrounded by snow that fell so thick it erased our tracks within minutes. Sarah got the emergency radio working within an hour. Standard distress call. Our coordinates. Request for immediate rescue. But the storm that had come out of nowhere showed no signs of clearing. Visibility was 0, temperature dropping to 30 below. The rescue coordinator told us it would be at least 24 hours before they could reach us, possibly longer. We had survival gear, emergency blankets, flares, a small stove. Enough supplies to last 3 days if we rationed carefully. We huddled in the back section of the plane where the structure was most intact, sharing body heat, trying to stay calm. That is when we first heard the voice. It came through the emergency radio around 8 that night. Not the rescue coordinator, someone else. The signal was weak, crackling with static, but the words were clear enough to understand. The voice asked if we were okay, asked how many survivors, asked if we needed help. Sarah responded. Gave our status, asked who was speaking, asked if rescue was on the way. The voice said it was close, said it could see our lights, said it was coming to help us. Then the transmission cut out. Just static. Sarah tried raising them again but got no response. She radioed the rescue coordinator, asked if they had dispatched a ground team. They said negative. Weather was too severe. No one could reach us until morning at the earliest. So who had we been talking to? The passenger sitting nearest the radio was a geologist named Marcus Webb. He had been flying these mountains for 10 years on survey missions. He said something that made my blood run cold. He said there were stories, old stories from native communities and early trappers. Stories about voices in the storms, things that called to lost travelers, things that pretended to be help. We dismissed it. Stress, fear. The mind plays tricks in extreme situations. The voice had probably been another aircraft monitoring emergency frequencies. Nothing supernatural. Nothing to worry about beyond our immediate survival concerns. Then at 9:15, we saw the light. A flashlight beam sweeping through the snow maybe 100 yards from the crash site. Moving steadily. Coming toward us, we shouted. Banged on the fuselage. Fired a flare that lit up the darkness in brilliant red. The light stopped. Seemed to orient on our position. Then started moving toward us again. But something was wrong with the way it moved. Too smooth. Too steady. Like it was gliding over the snow rather than walking through it. And there was no sound, no footsteps crunching, no voice calling back to us, just that light, getting closer, and a feeling of dread that grew heavier with every passing second. The light stopped about 50 feet away, just stopped, and stayed there, pointing at us, not moving, not responding to our shouts, just this silent, horrifying presence standing in the storm. Then it went out. Complete darkness, complete silence except for the wind. We waited, 10 minutes, 20. Nothing. Sarah tried the radio again. Static. Then that voice. Clearer now. Closer. It asked why we had not come out. Asked why we were hiding. Asked if we wanted to be rescued. The tone was wrong. Too flat. Too emotionless. And there was something underneath it. Something that sounded hungry. Sarah told the voice to identify itself. Demanded credentials. Demanded proof it was legitimate rescue. The response came slowly. Each word deliberate and chilling. The voice said it knew we were cold. Knew we were scared. Said it could help. Said all we had to do was come outside. Step into the snow. Follow the light. Then we heard it laugh. Not human, something else. Something that knew we were trapped. That knew we had no choice but to wait. That knew morning was still hours away and anything could happen in the darkness between now and dawn. One of the other passengers, a woman named Lisa Park, started crying. Said she wanted to go home. Said she could not take this anymore. Marcus put his arm around her. Told her to stay calm. Told her whatever was out there could not get inside the plane. That is when we heard the footsteps. On the roof of the fuselage. Heavy, deliberate. Walking from the tail section toward where we huddled. The metal groaned under the weight. Snow fell through gaps in the twisted wreckage. Something was on top of the plane. Something was testing the structure. Looking for a way in. We grabbed anything we could use as weapons. A fire extinguisher. A metal strut. The flare gun. 6 people pressed against the back wall of the ruined aircraft, listening to those footsteps move back and forth above us, searching. Then they stopped, right above our heads. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then the voice came again. Not through the radio, from directly above us, clear as day despite the storm. It said our names, all of our names, one by one, like it was taking attendance, like it was marking us for something. The banging started at midnight. Rhythmic, steady, like someone trying to pry open a door. But there was no door left intact. The entire front section was crumpled beyond recognition. Whatever was out there was testing every weak point, every gap, every place where the metal had torn and separated. We did not sleep. We took turns watching the gaps in the fuselage with our flashlights, looking for movement, listening for any sign of what hunted us in the darkness. Around 3 a.m, the storm cleared. Suddenly, completely. The wind stopped. The snow stopped. The clouds parted to reveal stars so bright they hurt to look at. And in that clarity, we saw the footprints. They circled the crash site. Dozens of circuits. But they were wrong. Too far apart. Too deep. Like whatever made them was impossibly large or impossibly heavy. And they did not lead to anywhere. They just circled endlessly in the snow, around and around the plane, with no beginning point and no end. The rescue helicopter arrived at dawn. We were all still alive. Hypothermic. Traumatized. But physically intact. The crew was professional, efficient, got us loaded and away from that place within 20 minutes. On the flight back to Valdez, I asked the rescue coordinator about ground teams, about anyone who might have been in the area overnight. He looked at me like I was insane. Said nothing could survive out there in those conditions. Said even if someone wanted to attempt to rescue, the terrain and weather made it impossible. I told him about the voice on the radio, about the light, about the footsteps on the plane. He did not say anything, just exchanged a look with his co-pilot that told me they had heard similar stories before, that we were not the first to report something disturbing in those mountains. The investigation into the crash was standard. Engine failure due to a manufacturing defect that had affected multiple aircraft. Mechanical, explainable, nothing unusual except our unlikely survival. But they never explained the footprints. The photographs the rescue team took showed them clearly. Massive, circular pattern around the crash site. Leading nowhere. The official report called them an anomaly. Said wind patterns and snowdrift could create unusual formations. Said trauma and stress could cause survivors to misinterpret natural phenomena. But I know what I heard. I know what stalked us through that endless night. And I am not the only one. Sarah Chen quit flying entirely. Moved to Arizona. Said she could not stand the thought of being in Alaska darkness ever again. Marcus Webb continued his survey work but refuses to fly northeast of Valdez. Says there are places in those mountains that should be left alone. That some valleys do not belong to us and resent our presence. I still fly. It is all I know how to do. But I file new routes now. Give that area a wide berth. Tell my passengers it is for weather patterns and fuel efficiency. The truth is I am terrified of going back. Terrified of engine trouble. Terrified of finding myself on the ground in that wilderness again, waiting for darkness to fall and that voice to start calling my name. Because the thing that hunted us that night was patient. It did not break into the plane, did not force its way inside. It just waited, tested, marked us, like it knew we would be back eventually, like it knew the mountains claim everyone who flies over them often enough. Sometimes late at night, when I am alone in my apartment, I hear my emergency radio click on. Just static, just white noise, but underneath it, if I listen carefully, I can hear something that sounds almost like breathing. Like something is still out there, still monitoring the frequency. Still waiting for the next time conditions are right and a plane goes down in that unnamed valley. The voice on the emergency radio was not one of ours. The footprints in the snow did not belong to any rescuer. And whatever walks the Chugach Mountains in the darkness is still there, patient and hungry, calling to the lost and waiting for them to follow the light into the storm. I survived that crash, but part of me is still in that valley, listening to footsteps on the roof, hearing my name spoken by something that should not know it, and wondering what would have happened if the storm had lasted just one more night. Story 2. Anchorage Snow Trails, The Vanishing. I need to tell you what happened to me in Alaska because nobody else will listen. The police want to talk about it. My family stopped answering my calls. But you need to know what's really out there in that darkness, beyond the edge of where civilized people dare to go. It started on a Friday in February when I drove up the Glen Highway toward Anchorage. The sky was doing something wrong. Even now, months later, I can describe it properly. The clouds weren't moving. They were just hanging there, dark and pregnant with something unsettling. The kind of gray that makes you feel small and watched. I am a normal guy, 38 years old, worked in logistics for 15 years, divorced, no kids. I took a solo trip to clear my head. Nothing dramatic, just me, my truck, and what I thought would be a peaceful winter getaway to the last real wilderness left in America. I had no idea I was driving toward a nightmare so deeply terrifying that it would rewrite everything I understand about fear itself. The motel I found was called the Northway. Old place, probably built in the 70s. With that creepy charm that haunted buildings always seem to carry. The parking lot was empty except for one truck parked in the corner, covered in frost so thick it looked like the vehicle had been there for years. The office smelled like cigarette smoke and something else, something metallic and wrong that I couldn't quite place. The owner barely looked at me. A woman in her 60s with hollow eyes that seemed to be looking through me rather than at me. She handed me a key without asking questions. Room 114. I didn't think anything of it then. I was just tired and wanted a hot shower. That night, I heard the snowmobile. It came around 3 in the morning. The engine sound cutting through the darkness like a saw through bone. It was loud enough to wake me from a restless sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to it circle the motel once, twice, 3 times. Then it stopped directly outside my window. I heard nothing for what might have been 30 seconds or might have been an hour. My heart was hammering, the kind of fear that doesn't have a logical explanation, the kind that comes from some ancient part of your brain that still remembers when the night meant death. Then it accelerated into the distance. Gone. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went to the front desk and asked about the snowmobile. The owner woman looked at me with something that might have been recognition or dread. She didn't answer my question. Instead, she said something that should have made me leave right then. She said, "Some people hear things here. Not everyone, but some people." Then she turned away and disappeared into the back office. That is when I should have packed my truck and driven south. But I didn't. I was curious, and curiosity, I learned, is a specific kind of stupidity. I spent the day driving around Anchorage, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. I bought supplies at a grocery store, ate at a diner, pumped gas. The world looked like it always did, but something underneath it felt different. People, the smile seemed forced. Their eyes kept sliding away from mine. I felt like I was seeing the town through a dirty window, like there was a reality behind the surface that I wasn't quite able to perceive. That night, I went to a bar called The Frontier. It was the kind of place where old men come to drink and forget. The bartender was young, maybe 25, with the kind of dead eyes that come from working too long in dark places. I ordered a whiskey and sat in the corner. That is when I heard them talking. 2 older men at a table behind me weren't bothering to keep their voices down. One of them was saying something about Anchorage Snow Trails. I'd seen the name on a sign when I drove up to the motel area. It was a snowmobile rental place, the only business for miles in that direction. The man was saying that someone had rented from them. Last month, a woman rented a snowmobile early in the morning and never came back. Police found her tracks, snowmobile tracks going deep into the forest, perfect in the fresh snow. But there were no return tracks. Nothing. The machine was eventually found 3 miles out, engine still slightly warm, but abandoned. And the woman was never found. The eerie part was that there were no other tracks around the snowmobile. No footprints, no drag marks, nothing to indicate the woman had ever left that machine. It was like she simply evaporated. I ordered another whiskey. My hands were shaking. The bartender watched me with those dead eyes. When I asked him about it, he said the woman, his name was Catherine Pierce. She'd come from Seattle. Solo traveler, like me. The police investigation went nowhere. They searched for 2 weeks. They brought in dogs, helicopters, search teams. Nothing. She disappeared into that Alaskan darkness like she never existed. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. He said there had been others. At least 4 people in the last 10 years, all around the same area, all vanishing under impossible circumstances. A hiker who left no body. A couple whose cabin was found empty with food still cooking on the stove. A mailman whose truck was found idling at the trailhead with the door open. All gone. All impossible. I left the bar and drove back to the Northway in a state of heightened dread. The terrifying reality of what I heard was sinking in. This wasn't the urban legend. These were real missing person cases. Real people, real darkness, real fear. The motel office was dark when I arrived. I went directly to my room and locked the door. I sat on the bed, fully clothed, and waited for something I couldn't name. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the snowmobile again. This time, it didn't circle the motel. It came straight toward the building and stopped right outside my door. I could hear the engine idling, that low, hungry sound. I crept to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. There was a snowmobile outside, but there was no one on it. No driver, no passenger, just the machine, running, as if operated by an invisible hand. I watched it for what must have been 5 minutes. Then, slowly, the engine shut off. Silence flooded back in, and the fear deepened because now the darkness felt complete. I didn't go back to sleep. I stood at that window all night, watching the snowmobile slowly accumulate frost. When the sun rose, it was still there. By mid-morning, staff had removed it. No one said anything to me about it. No one acknowledged that anything unusual had happened. It was like the whole incident had been erased. That afternoon, I decided to drive out to the Anchorage Snow Trails rental place. The chilling curiosity was overpowering my sense of self-preservation. I had to see it. I had to understand. The place was a small building surrounded by snowmobiles. 3 of them. The door was locked, but through the window, I could see someone inside. A man, middle-aged. He was staring at something on the wall, his body completely still. I knocked. He didn't move. I knocked again, harder. He didn't even blink. Finally, he turned toward me with an expression that was utterly devoid of life. His eyes were the same as everyone else in this haunted corner of Alaska. Empty, like he was being controlled by something wearing a human suit. He opened the door. I asked him about Catherine Pierce. His answer chilled me to my core. He said, "We don't remember her. Never heard of her." But then he added something that didn't make sense. He said, "But the snow remembers. The snow always remembers." I left. I drove back to the motel, packed my things, and got in my truck. I was leaving. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to be part of it anymore. That's when the landlady stopped me in the parking lot. She stood directly in front of my truck, small and fragile looking, but I couldn't bring myself to hit the gas and drive around her. There was something unsettling about her that transcended normal human fear. She said, "You, the one who heard the snowmobile." "Aaron." "To you." I didn't answer. She said, "Not everyone hears it. It chooses who it visits. It's been visiting people for a very long time. Longer than the town has existed. I think it likes you." I asked her what she meant. What was choosing people? What was the snowmobile? Her answer was so disturbing that I'm still not sure I understood it. She said the snowmobile was the sound of something old. Something that lived in the snow and the darkness. Something that had been there long before Alaska was a state, before it was colonized, before anyone carved roads through its wilderness. Every so often, it called someone. And that person heard it, and they couldn't resist it. They rented a machine and drove into the darkness, and the darkness took them. But here, it's the thing that makes this narrative so utterly terrifying. Those people weren't dead. They were still out there, in the snow, part of the darkness, still conscious, still aware, but transformed into something else entirely. The snowmobile sounds people heard? Those were the vanished ones, still trying to call others out into the darkness. I got in my truck and drove. I didn't stop for hours. By the time I looked in my mirror, the sun was setting and I was nowhere near that haunted place. For 3 months, I told no one what happened. I tried to convince myself it was paranoid delusion, some kind of psychological episode brought on by isolation and fear. But then I saw the news. Another person had gone missing near Anchorage Snow Trails. A solo hiker. And again, the tracks went one direction. No return. The police investigation is ongoing. They say there is no evidence of foul play. No body, no crime scene, just absence. Perfect, inexplicable absence. Last week, I was driving through Colorado when I heard something that made my blood freeze. A sound I wasn't expecting. The unmistakable rumble of a snowmobile engine, faint and distant, coming through my car speakers on a classical music radio station. Not a real snowmobile, something deeper, something that shouldn't be possible so far from Alaska. It was only there for a few seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by Beethoven. I've been listening to that radio station every night since, waiting. Terrified, because I think I understand now. The darkness in Alaska, the thing that wears the sound of a snowmobile, the intelligence that hides in the snow and the shadow of deep forests, it is not limited to one location. It is reaching out, expanding, finding people who heard the truth about what is really out there in the wilderness of America. I left a warning with the authorities. They dismissed me, said I was experiencing stress-related delusions. They were not listening because they can hear it yet. But they will. The sound is spreading. And if you rereading this, if you re-listening to this story in the dark, late at night when the normal world is asleep, I want you to know something. The next time you hear a strange noise outside your window, the next time you feel watched in the darkness, the next time you find yourself inexplicably drawn to a snowmobile or a rental shop or a desolate highway that calls to something deep in your primitive brain, you remember this account. You remember Anchorage Snow Trails and the woman named Catherine Pierce and the others whose names we never know because they've been taken into a darkness that transcends death itself. I don't know if I'm being haunted or hunted. I don't know if the next time I close my eyes, I'll wake up somewhere in the Alaskan snow, still conscious, still screaming silently, still trying to call others into the terrifying darkness with the sound of an engine that never dies. But I know that something is calling, and every night, I'm more afraid it will call for me. The snow remembers, and the snow is patient. It will find us all eventually. Story 3. Haunting at the Alaskan Hotel, Juneau. I should have left after the first night. That is what haunts me now, more than anything else. Knowing I could have walked away, but I didn't. I stayed. And what I experienced in that crumbling building in downtown Juneau, Alaska, fundamentally changed what I believe is possible in this world. It started with a photograph. I am a paranormal investigator, though calling myself that feels pretentious. Really, I am just a guy from Seattle who got obsessed with the unexplained. I spend my weekends chasing ghost stories, collecting police records, interviewing old-timers in forgotten towns. Most of the time, I find nothing. Empty buildings, creaking floorboards, nothing scary, nothing real. But sometimes, just sometimes, I find something that stops me cold. That photograph was taken in 1957, according to the date on the back. A woman stood in the hallway of the Alaskan Hotel, wearing a long dark dress that looked like something from the 1920s. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her expression was distant, haunted. The terrifying part? The woman in the photo matched a police report I discovered. A woman named Margaret Holloway, found dead in room 301 of the Alaskan Hotel on February 14, 1951. Frozen solid, no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just Margaret, lying in her bed, wearing that same long dark dress. But here, this is what really bothered me. The photograph was dated 6 years after her death. I booked a room. Juneau is the kind of place that feels stuck in time. Mountains rise up from every direction, trapping the town like it was in a stone prison. The sky stays dark for most of the year. When I arrived in November, sunset came at 4 in the afternoon. By 7, the darkness was absolute. The Alaskan Hotel sits on Franklin Street, wedged between other old buildings like it is being squeezed from all sides. The exterior is faded yellow, the paint peeling in long strips that make it look diseased. The lobby smelled like old wood and decay. The desk clerk was ancient, his eyes watery and unfocused. He didn't ask questions when I checked in. He just handed me a key and looked away, like he knew something I didn't. Room 301, the same room where Margaret Holloway was found, the 3rd floor. The elevator was terrifying, even before anything strange happened. It was the original, from the 1920s, made of brass and glass with a folding gate that had to be pulled shut by hand. As it climbed, I heard every groan of the cable, every crack in the shaft. The building seemed alive, breathing around me, my creepy elevator rising like I was descending into something's stomach instead. The hallway on the third floor was darker than it should have been. The lights were on, but they seemed to push the darkness back only a few feet. The walls were covered in old floral wallpaper that was peeling and water-stained. I could hear the building settling, or maybe it was footsteps, that unsettling sound that could be either. The kind of eerie atmosphere that makes your brain start playing tricks. My room was small, a bed, a dresser, a window overlooking the street below. The window had a single latch, and it was firmly closed. The room felt cold, not from air conditioning, but from the kind of cold that comes from being separated from the world, isolated and cut off. It was a chilling feeling, like I was already dead. I should have turned back. I lay in bed that first night, listening to the building. Every settling creak, every distant sound from other rooms, every noise from the street below. Sleep was impossible. My mind kept drifting to Margaret Holloway, wondering what her final moments were like. Was she scared? Did she hear something that made her heart race? Did she understand what was happening to her? Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, a measured pace that suggested someone was walking without urgency, without fear. The footsteps came from one end of the hallway, moving toward my room. Each step was clear and distinct. Creak, pause, creak, pause. The nightmarish rhythm of something approaching. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I waited for them to pass my door, but they didn't. They stopped, right outside room 301. I got out of bed and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. That is when the disturbing realization hit me. There was nothing there, but something had definitely been there. I had heard it. I knew I had heard it. The bone-chilling certainty of that knowledge was almost worse than if I had actually seen something. At least then I could rationalize it. At least then I could find an explanation. But an invisible presence, an unseen footstep, that was something else entirely. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, looking out at the dark streets of Juneau, waiting for morning, waiting for the sun to rise. But even when it did, around 8 in the morning, the light didn't help. The sun was weak, barely bright enough to cut through the gloom. It hung low on the horizon, exhausted and struggling, like it wanted to go back down. The second night, I was prepared. I set my phone to record audio throughout the night. I wanted evidence. I wanted to be able to listen back in the morning and prove to myself that something was happening. Something real. Something that couldn't be explained away by creaking pipes or settling foundations. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up. The room was colder than it had been when I fell asleep. Not just cold, frigid. The kind of terrifying cold that makes your breath visible. I could see it in front of my face, little clouds of vapor that hung in the air like they were refusing to dissipate. My hands were shaking, whether from the cold or from fear. I couldn't tell. That's when I heard the scratching. It was coming from inside the walls. A slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. The scratching moved along the wall behind the bed, moving from the head toward the foot, then back again. Up, down, up, down. It was methodical, like someone was trying to write a message in the plaster. The sound made my skin crawl. It made every nerve ending in my body scream. I grabbed my phone and played back the audio from the night before. The footsteps were there, loud and clear on the recording. Creak, pause, creak, pause. But there was something else too, something I hadn't heard in real time. A whisper, just barely audible beneath the footsteps. A voice that seemed to be saying the same word over and over. It took me several listens to understand what it was saying. Leave. Not a hallucination. Not my imagination. A voice on my recording, captured by the microphone, documented and real. Someone, something, was telling me to leave. I should have left that morning. That's what the terrifying voice was asking me to do. But I didn't. Instead, I sat in the lobby, drank terrible coffee, and made phone calls. I called the Juneau Police Department and asked about the Margaret Holloway case. The officer I spoke to was confused at first, then dismissive. She checked the records and told me there was indeed a death in 1951, but there was no file, no official record of how she died or why the case was closed. It was like the investigation had been erased. That's when I knew something was deeply wrong. I went to the local library and found old newspapers on microfiche. The Juneau newspapers from February 1951 didn't mention Margaret Holloway at all. It was like her death had been kept quiet, buried, forgotten. But one newspaper from March of that year had a small article about a mysterious death at Downtown Hotel. No names, no details, just the eerie fact that a guest had been found dead, the body already frozen, with no explanation for how the death occurred. The article mentioned something else though. There had been other deaths at the Alaskan Hotel over the years. Not many, maybe one every 10 or 15 years. Always mysterious, always unexplained, always the guests who had stayed in rooms on the upper floors. I went back to my room on the third night. I should have checked out. I should have driven back to the ferry terminal and left that terrifying place behind forever. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me deeper into this mystery, some horrible fascination that overrode every instinct for self-preservation. I needed to know what was happening here. I needed to understand. The scratching came again that night, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't just in the walls. It was on the window. Long, slow scratches against the glass, like someone was outside, trying to get in. I went to the window and looked out. The street below was empty. The buildings across the way were dark. But the scratching continued, a horrifying sound that made me feel like my mind was fragmenting. I looked down at my hands. They were bleeding. My fingernails had been scratching at the window frame so hard that they had torn open, leaving trails of blood on the white paint. I didn't remember doing it. I had no awareness of doing it. But the evidence was right there. Fresh blood on my hands, my nails broken and raw. That is when I understood. Something was using my body. Something was making me do things without my conscious knowledge or consent. The chilling realization washed over me like ice water. I wasn't in control anymore. The Alaskan Hotel had control now. I left the next morning. I didn't check out properly. I just packed my things and walked out, leaving the key on the bed. The desk clerk didn't try to stop me. He just watched me go with those watery, unfocused eyes, like he'd seen this before. Like he knew I'd be back. I drove to the ferry terminal on shaking legs, feeling like I was being watched the entire way. The terrifying sensation didn't stop even when I boarded the ship to leave Juneau. Even now, months later, I still feel like something is pulling at me, trying to drag me back to that building. But here is what really makes my skin crawl. Last week, I discovered something while reviewing my recordings. The voice on the tape, the one saying, "Leave," it wasn't just any voice. Using audio analysis software, I had it enhanced and filtered, and what I heard beneath the static, beneath the layers of distortion, was unmistakable. It was my own voice. The voice telling me to leave was my voice, as it might sound in 15 or 20 years. Older, colder, desperate, like a warning from a version of myself that had learned something horrible about what was waiting for me in that building. A disturbing message from the future, telling my past self to stay away. But there was something else on that recording too. Something that comes through clearly now that I know to listen for it. In the background of the scratching, beneath my own voice, there's another sound. The sound of someone breathing in the dark. And underneath that, whispered so quietly that it is almost inaudible. A woman's voice saying a name. My name, Margaret Holloway, is still in that hotel. She is still waiting in those hallways. And she has been waiting for someone. She has been waiting for me. I know this with a certainty that chills me to my core. I don't know how I know it, but I do. The Alaskan Hotel is a terrible place, a building that feeds on something in certain people. It calls to us. It draws us in. And once they heard it calling, once they felt its pull, you can never truly leave. Sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps in my apartment. Slow and deliberate. Creak, pause, creak, pause. They move from room to room, getting closer to where I sleep. And I know, with a certainty that borders on madness, that they are not real. The horrifying footsteps are my own, echoing from a future where I've already returned to that building for the final time. They were the footsteps of my haunted self, walking those dark hallways forever. The Alaskan Hotel is still there. The yellow paint is still peeling. The ancient elevator still groans as it climbs. Room 301 still waits. And somewhere in the darkness of those hallways, a woman in a long dark dress walks slowly, her pale face calm and patient, knowing that I will come back. Knowing that everyone comes back, eventually. The question that keeps me awake at night, the one that terrifies me more than anything else, is simple. When I do go back, And I know, with unsettling certainty, that I will. Will I be the one doing the walking? Or will I be something else? Will I be Margaret Holloway, waiting for the next person to check into room 301? Will I be the eerie presence in the hallway? The chilling voice on the recording? The invisible force that scratches in the darkness? Will I become part of the Alaskan Hotel? Another ghost trapped forever in its walls? Another lost soul calling out to the living? Another disturbing mystery for some poor investigator to stumble upon years from now? These are the questions that haunt me, and I think, deep in my bones, I already know the answers. Story 4. Nome, it's missing miners. Voices beneath the snow. I hear them every night now. The tapping, it never stops. Even when I'm driving down the highway, even when I am inside my own home with all the doors locked, I can still hear that rhythmic, chilling sound. Tap, 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 like someone is trapped inside the walls, trying desperately to signal that they're still alive, that they're still down there. This is what happened to me in Nome, Alaska. This is the terrifying story I've been trying to find the courage to tell for 6 months. I went to Nome last February for what I thought would be a simple research trip. I am a geologist, which might sound boring, but my specialty is the gold deposits of Alaska, and Nome is basically the most important location for gold mining history in North America. The 1900s gold rush brought thousands of men to this remote corner of the world, all desperately seeking their fortune in the frozen ground. Most of them never found anything. Many of them never left. Nome is the kind of place that feels like it exists outside of normal reality. It sits on the coast of the Bering Sea, literally at the edge of the continent. The nearest city is 200 miles away. In February, the population is only around 4,000 people, most of them tucked away in buildings trying to survive the darkness and cold. The sun doesn't rise at all in winter. It's 18 hours of twilight, then 6 hours of darkness. The darkness is absolute. It's the kind of darkness that makes you question whether the rest of the world still exists. I stayed at a small hotel downtown and spent my first few days examining mining records at the local historical society. I was researching productivity data from the early mining operations, trying to figure out why some shafts were suddenly abandoned while others continued operating for years. The pattern was strange. Every winter, like clockwork, miners would disappear. The disturbing thing was that they never found bodies. The miners just vanished into the frozen landscape, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and abandoned claim stakes that pointed to nowhere. On my third night, I decided to hike to one of the old mining sites. This was stupid. I knew it was stupid, but I was fascinated by the mystery, drawn to it in a way I couldn't fully explain. There was something about this place that felt wrong, something that made my instincts scream at me to leave. But I went anyway. The old mine shaft I wanted to visit was about 3 miles from town, up a gentle slope that was covered in deep snow. I brought a flashlight, a rope, and a sense of creeping dread that I couldn't shake. The hike took longer than expected because of the snow, and by the time I reached the shaft entrance, the twilight was fading into the eerie, unsettling gray that passes for darkness in Alaska during winter. The mine shaft opening was smaller than I expected. It was maybe 4 feet wide, a dark mouth carved into the mountainside by men who had been searching for gold over 100 years ago. The darkness inside was absolute. I could shine my flashlight into it, but the beam seemed to disappear into nothing, like the passage went down forever. I stood there for a long time, listening. That's when I heard it. The tapping. It was coming from somewhere deep inside the shaft. A rhythmic, chilling sound that seemed almost mechanical at first. Tap, tap, tap. It was steady and measured, like someone was hitting metal against rock in a pattern that had meaning. My heart started racing. There shouldn't be anyone down there. The mine had been abandoned for decades. But that sound was real. I wasn't imagining it. I called out into the darkness. My voice sounded small and insignificant, swallowed by the empty space. I waited for a response, but none came. Only the tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. Always the same rhythm. Never varying, never stopping. I should have left immediately. Every instinct told me to run back to town and never return. But instead, I moved closer to the shaft opening. I shone my flashlight down into the darkness and tried to see where the sound was coming from. The beam of light revealed a narrow passage that descended at a steep angle, disappearing into blackness. And there, just barely visible at the edge of my light, was something that made my blood run cold. A hand. It was reaching out from the darkness, pale and skeletal, covered in frost. The fingers were bent and twisted at unnatural angles, like the hand had been frozen in that position for a very long time. And as I watched, frozen in terrifying fear, I realized that the tapping sound was coming from that hand. The fingers were hitting against the rock wall, tap, 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 a frightening and desperate rhythm that had probably been going on for decades. I stumbled backward, slipping in the snow. My flashlight went flying, and I fell hard on my back. When I looked up at the sky, the stars were starting to appear. The unsettling darkness was deepening into complete blackness. I scrambled to my feet and ran back toward town, not stopping, not looking back. I made it back to the hotel shaking and disoriented. I wanted to tell someone what I'd seen, but who would believe me? A skeleton hand, frozen in time, still tapping against the rock after all these years? They'd think I was insane. So I said nothing. I stayed in my room that night, trying to convince myself that I imagined the whole thing, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. But I knew the terrifying truth. That hand was real, and it was still down there, trapped in the darkness, still tapping out that eerie message. The next morning, I did something I immediately regretted. I went to the local police station and reported what I found. I didn't mention the hand at first. I just said I heard unusual sounds coming from the old mine shaft and thought they should investigate. The officer I spoke to, a tired-looking man named Garrett, listened to my story with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something that changed everything. There had been other reports. Over the years, dozens of people had claimed to hear sounds coming from the old mine shafts around Nome. Tapping, scratching, strange rhythmic noises that seemed to come from deep underground. The police had investigated several times over the decades, but they never found anything. They sent people down into the shafts, and every single one of them had come back out saying the same thing. The sound stopped as soon as they got close. It was like whatever was making the noise knew when someone was coming and went silent. But there was something else, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. Garrett pulled out an old file and showed me documents dating back to the 1930s. Missing persons reports, dozens of them, miners who had gone into the old shafts and never come out. Official investigations that concluded the miners must have suffered some kind of mining accident and been buried by cave-ins. But here was the chilling part. There were never any bodies found. No cave-ins discovered, no explanation for where the miners had gone or what had happened to them. One report caught my eye. A miner named Thomas Blackwood had gone missing in 1923, along with his entire crew of 6 men. They'd gone into a shaft to stake a new claim and simply never emerged. A rescue team went in after them and found nothing. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no evidence of any accident. It was like the miners had simply vanished into the earth itself. But Thomas Blackwood, his name had been circled in red on one of the documents. And next to it, in handwriting that looked like it had been added much more recently, someone had written the word recent with a question mark. I asked Garrett what that meant. He looked uncomfortable. He told me that about 15 years ago, a group of hikers had reported hearing a voice coming from one of the mine shafts. A voice calling out a name. Thomas. Just the name, repeated over and over in a hoarse, desperate whisper. Thomas, Thomas, Thomas. The hikers had run away terrified. They reported it to the police, but when officers investigated, they found nothing. The terrifying implication hung in the air between us. A man missing for nearly 100 years, still calling out, still trapped somewhere in the darkness beneath Nome. I left the police station and drove out to the old mining sites. I know I shouldn't have. I know it was dangerous and stupid and foolish, but I was compelled by a need to understand what was happening here. I needed to know what those mines really contained. I visited 5 different shafts that day. At each location, I stood at the opening and listened carefully. At 4 of them, I heard nothing but the wind. At the 5th shaft, an old mine about 2 miles northeast of the first one I visited, I heard something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. Voices. They were faint and distorted, like they were being filtered through incredible distance and time. But they were definitely voices. Multiple voices, overlapping and echoing, all speaking at once in a chilling chorus that was almost impossible to understand. I tried to make out individual words, but it was too garbled, too disturbing. The voices seemed to be calling out, pleading for something, begging for help or mercy or release. The eerie quality of those voices, the desperate, hopeless tone, made me feel sick to my stomach. I recorded it on my phone. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted proof. Maybe I needed to be able to play it back later and convince myself that it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole terrifying thing. When I listened to the recording that night in my hotel room, I could hear it clearly. Those voices, crying out from the darkness below. But there was something else on the recording too, something that made my blood run cold. Underneath the chorus of voices, there was another sound, a rhythmic tapping, faint but distinct. Tap, 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 and beneath that, so quiet I almost missed it, a single voice that was much clearer than the others. A voice that seemed to be speaking directly to me. It was saying my name. I packed my bag and checked out of the hotel that night. I didn't sleep. I drove to the airport and caught the first flight out of Nome at dawn. I didn't look back at that horrible place. I didn't want to see it again. Do you want to think about it ever again? But the problem was that it came with me. 6 months later, I'm back in my home in Anchorage, and the tapping has never stopped. It's always there, at the edge of my hearing, a constant reminder of what I encountered in those haunted mine shafts. Some nights it's louder than others. Some nights it's almost unbearable, but it is always there, always present, always creeping, like it is burrowing deeper into my mind. I've tried everything. I've talked to therapists who suggested it was stress-related, maybe a form of auditory hallucination brought on by anxiety. I've seen neurologists who found nothing wrong with my hearing. I've tried sleeping medication, white noise machines, sound-dampening headphones. Nothing helps. The tapping continues. Last week, something worse happened. I woke up at 3 a.m. and realized I couldn't move. Not because of sleep paralysis, though that is what I wanted it to be, but because there was someone standing at the foot of my bed. A figure in the darkness, barely visible, watching me. I could sense its presence more than I could see it. And when I finally found the strength to turn on the lamp, there was nothing there. The room was empty, but I could smell something. A scent like frozen earth and decomposition, like a grave opened after 100 years of being sealed. The terrifying, sickening smell of something that should have stayed buried finally being exposed to the world. I got out of bed and went to the window. Outside, the Anchorage night was quiet and still. But as I stood there, looking out at the streets, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the frost on my window, someone had written a message. Come back. The letters were crude and uneven, like they'd been written by something that didn't quite remember how hands worked anymore. But the message was clear. Something in those minds wanted me to come back. Something had followed me all the way from Nome. Something that wouldn't let me forget about those tapping sounds and those desperate, pleading voices crying out from the darkness. I've been researching the missing miners obsessively. They found documents, historical records, accounts from people who knew some of the men who disappeared. And they discovered something horrifying. The miners didn't just vanish randomly. They were specifically chosen. The men who went missing were all men who had done something wrong in their lives. Men with secrets. Men who had hurt other people or betrayed their friends or stolen from others. It's like the minds were selective, pulling only certain men down into the darkness. The question that keeps me awake at night, the one that fills me with absolute terror, is simple. Why did I hear my name on that recording? What did I do that made me worthy of being called by whatever is trapped in those shafts? What secret am I keeping that marked me as someone who needs to be pulled down into the darkness? Last night, I checked my research again. I went back through the lists of missing miners, the names that had been swallowed by the frozen earth, and I found something that made all the color drain from my face. One of the miners who had disappeared, a man named Samuel Bridges who went missing in 1931, had a descendant, a great-grandson. The records show that this great-grandson worked in Alaska as a surveyor for many years. His name was David Garrett. He was the police officer who had shown me the missing persons files. The officer who knew about the voices. The officer who had watched me carefully when I came in to report what I heard. I went back to the police station and asked to see him. The receptionist told me that Officer Garrett had taken an extended leave of absence. No one knew when he'd be back. When I asked for more details, she got uncomfortable and suggested I leave. I am writing this now because I need someone to know what really happened in Nome. I need someone to understand what those mines actually are. They were not just abandoned shafts dug by desperate men looking for gold. They be something older, something that has been there longer than the gold rush, longer than Nome itself. And they were still hungry. I can hear the tapping right now as I type this. It's coming from the walls of my apartment. It's coming from inside my closet. It's coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And I know what it means. It means they were still trying to reach me. The missing miners, the men who disappeared into the frozen darkness, they were still down there. And they were still tapping, still calling, still waiting. The terrifying truth is that I'm going to go back to Nome. I don't want to, but I can feel it pulling at me like chains dragging me backward. I can feel the weight of the darkness, the crushing pressure of the frozen earth, the chilling knowledge that something down there knows my name and is waiting for me to come home. When I get there, I'll go to one of those mines. I'll descend into the darkness, and I'll join the chorus of voices, adding my own to the eerie tapping that echoes up from below, the disturbing rhythm that has been sounding in the frozen earth for over 100 years. Maybe someday, someone else will hear us. Maybe someday, another person will stand at the mouth of one of those shafts and listen to our voices crying out. And maybe, just maybe, they'll have the sense to run away and never come back. Unlike me, they'll be strong enough to resist. Unlike me, they want to hear their own name echoing up from the darkness. Unlike me, they'll still have a choice. But I don't have a choice anymore. The mines of Nome have claimed me. And in the deep, freezing darkness beneath that desolate town, I'll be tapping forever. Story 5. Frozen Ground Killer. Anchorage, As Darkest Secret Reimagined. They found my sister's body 3 miles from the highway outside Anchorage, buried under 6 feet of frozen earth where no one should have been digging in January. But here, it's what the police never told the public, the part that keeps me awake at night, the part that makes me check my doors 5 times before bed. She wasn't the only fresh grave they discovered in that godforsaken stretch of wilderness. They found 7 others within 100 yards, and not one of them matched the dental records of Robert Hansen, the man they convicted 30 years ago for being the frozen ground killer, Anchorage's most terrifying serial murderer. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand that the official narrative, the one everyone accepted, was a lie. And if you, re-listening to this, if you live anywhere near that frozen darkness in Alaska, or if you planning to visit those desolate highways, you need to hear what really happened. You need to know why I can, to go back. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I was working as a state trooper in Alaska when my sister went missing in the winter of 2004. Michelle was 28, beautiful, and reckless. She loved to hike in the mountains outside Anchorage, to explore the creepy wilderness that most people avoided. I begged her to stay in the city, to drive the main roads, to stick to populated areas. But she laughed at my fears. She thought I was being paranoid, overprotective. She didn't understand that the dark forests surrounding Anchorage hold secrets that would chill your blood. 3 weeks after Michelle disappeared, hunters found her remains. The state medical examiner identified her through dental records and a unique tattoo on her left shoulder. The case was labeled a tragedy, a cautionary tale about the dangers of solo hiking in Alaska, this brutal terrain. Robert Hansen, already imprisoned for his other murders, was investigated but not charged in connection with her death. The case eventually went cold. Everyone moved on, everyone except me. But last year, everything changed. A road construction crew near Chena Hot Springs decided to expand the gravel pit deeper into the surrounding forest. On the 3rd day of excavation, they hit something hard. Not a rock, bones, human bones. The crew called the authorities, and that is when the nightmare began to unravel. That is when the creepy truth started to surface. What followed was a federal investigation so secretive, so carefully controlled, that even now, even with my access and connections, I only know fragments of what they discovered. But those fragments are enough to destroy your sense of safety forever. They exhumed 7 graves, 7, all dating back to different years spanning from 1994 to 2004. All in a remote location that Robert Hansen had no documented connection to. The remains were scattered, partially decomposed, buried with deliberate precision in a pattern that suggested someone with extensive knowledge of forensic evidence. Someone who knew exactly how to hide bodies in the frozen ground. Someone who understood law enforcement protocols well enough to stay ahead of investigators for a decade. The dental records told a horrifying story. 4 of the 7 victims had no matches in any criminal database, any missing persons file, any official record. They were ghosts, complete unknowns. The other 3 were women who had been listed as runaways or accidental deaths, cases that nobody cared enough to investigate deeply. Nobody except whoever had been murdering them methodically, systematically, with terrifying precision. The FBI brought in specialists. They ran DNA analysis, mitochondrial testing, every forensic technique available. And what they found was unsettling, eerie, wrong. The DNA evidence indicated that at least 3 of the victims had been preserved in a way that suggested advanced knowledge of chemistry, possibly cryogenic techniques that had been adapted for outdoor use. There were traces of industrial-grade preservatives in the soil samples. Someone had been maintaining those bodies, keeping them, studying them, perhaps even revisiting them over years. That is when the first real break came, and I want you to understand what this means. How this revelation changed everything. A partial thumbprint was recovered from a copper bracelet found near one of the grave sites. The print was run through every database available. No match. No criminal history. No military service record. No employment history. But the print appeared on at least 3 of the disturbing grave sites. Someone had visited multiple burial locations. Someone had touched multiple victims. Someone was still out there. The investigation went completely dark after that. Federal agents began showing up in Anchorage. They interviewed me multiple times, asking increasingly strange questions about my sister's activities, her relationships, whether she had ever mentioned strange encounters in the wilderness. Then they asked about my past, my access to biological materials as a young police officer, my knowledge of forensics, my whereabouts on specific dates. That is when I realized something horrifying, something that made my skin crawl with a chilling realization. They weren't just looking for a serial killer. They were investigating whether someone on the inside, someone within law enforcement, might be involved. The thought was terrifying. The implications were worse. I started digging into old cases myself. I pulled files that should have been archived decades ago. I spoke to retired detectives who had worked the original Robert Hansen case. And what they told me was disturbing. Several of them mentioned that Hansen had claimed he was being protected, that he was taking the fall for someone else, that the real killer was still hunting in the mountains. At the time, his claims were dismissed as the ravings of a condemned man trying to escape responsibility. But what if he wasn't lying? What if he was being forced to stay silent? What if the protocol was to keep this nightmare secret, to protect someone within the system? The case files I found revealed something even more unsettling. In 1999, a state trooper named Marcus Shale had been investigated for suspicious activity. 3 women he had encountered during routine traffic stops later disappeared. 2 of them were eventually found in different locations, confirmed as Hansen, as victims. The 3rd was never found. The investigation into Shale was quietly closed. He was quietly transferred to a desk job in Fairbanks. He eventually retired with full pension and moved to somewhere in the lower 48. I became obsessed with finding Marcus Shale. I tracked him down through old retirement paperwork. He was living in a small cabin outside of Bend, Oregon. I drove there. I watched his house for 3 days. What I saw made my blood run cold. He had photographs, dozens of them, pinned to the walls of his garage visible through the window. Images of women hiking, women driving, women at bus stops in Anchorage. Some of those photographs appeared in missing persons databases from years I knew the real killer was still hunting. One photograph showed a woman I recognized from a cold case file. She had vanished in 2001. Another showed my sister, Michelle, on a hiking trail, taken from a distance, without her knowledge. I should have gone to the authorities. I should have reported what I saw. But I was terrified, truly afraid, because I understood something that the FBI might have already figured out. If Shale had been investigating for years and nobody had stopped him, if nobody had ever truly prosecuted him, then someone else was protecting him. Someone powerful, someone inside the system. I drove away from that house in Oregon, and I never looked back. I transferred out of Alaska, resigned from the state police, and tried to disappear into civilian life. But the haunting knowledge never left me. The creepy certainty that a predator was still alive, still remembering, still possibly hunting somewhere across this vast country. Last month, I saw a news report. A woman's remains were discovered near Bend, Oregon, buried in a way that matched the pattern from those Anchorage graves. The preliminary examination suggested the body had been there for several years. Authorities are investigating. They haven't to release much information. But I know with absolute certainty what they were going to find. The nightmare that was supposed to end with Robert Hansen, this conviction in Anchorage, is still happening. The real killer, whoever he is, whatever he has become, is still out there. And the system, the law enforcement infrastructure that should protect us, is either unable or unwilling to stop him. That is the scariest part. Not the murdered women, not the frozen graves, not the systematic evasion of justice. It is the knowledge that somewhere in this country, someone is still hunting, and nobody can stop him because the cover-up goes too deep, reaches too high, touches too many people who benefit from keeping this horrifying secret. I write this knowing it could disappear. I write this knowing that law enforcement might find me and silence me. But someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand that the unsettling darkness surrounding Anchorage didn't end with the trial. It evolved, it adapted, and it's still spreading across America like a creeping shadow. If you listening to this, if you driving alone on an Alaskan highway or hiking through the wilderness, understand something fundamental about fear. The predators we don't know about are infinitely more terrifying than the ones we do. The serial killers who are caught, who face justice, who were imprisoned, are just the ones who made mistakes. The ones still hunting, still evolving their methods, still being protected by silence and corruption, are the truly nightmarish ones. My sister is gone. 7 other women whose names nobody remembers are gone. And there, as a man, possibly men, who are still out there, still hunting, still evading justice. And everyone who could stop them has decided, for reasons I can to fully understand, that the cover-up is worth maintaining. The frozen ground outside Anchorage holds more secrets than anyone will ever know. And I'm terrified of what might still be buried there, waiting beneath the ice, waiting in the darkness, waiting for someone to finally open their eyes and look at the truth. That is the real horror. Not the unknown killer, but the known conspiracy of silence. Story 6. Denali is Phantom Lights. The night we were hunted. I have to tell someone before it happens again. Before whatever followed us in that darkness finds someone else. My name is Frank Brennan. I was a park ranger in Denali National Park for 18 years. 18 years of blizzards, wildlife, and the raw power of Alaska's wilderness. Nothing scared me. Not avalanches, not bears, not the kind of isolation that would drive most people insane. I was comfortable in the darkness, confident in my training, certain that I understood the dangers. I was terribly, dangerously wrong. It started on a March evening when my team and I were responding to a missing hiker report. A woman named Sarah Mitchell, 32 years old, had been hiking the Wonder Lake Trail alone and hadn't to return to her lodge by nightfall. This was a routine call. Happens maybe 3 times a year. We find her, bring her back, file the paperwork, and move on. Nothing terrifying. Nothing to suggest that the night would strip away everything I believed about reality itself. My team consisted of myself, Marcus, who had been a ranger for 6 years, and David, our newest member at only 3 months on the job. We were equipped with thermal imaging, satellite communicators, heavy flashlights, and the kind of gear that makes you feel invincible against the darkness. We should have felt safe. We should have felt prepared. We started our search at 8:30 in the evening. The temperature was dropping fast, 40 below zero by my estimation, though the wind made it feel like something colder and crueler. The sky was so dark it felt like physical pressure against your eyes. No stars, no moon, just this complete, suffocating blackness that made me think we were searching inside the throat of something alive and hostile. We'd been hiking for 40 minutes when David saw the light. He pointed ahead of us, and at first, I thought he was seeing something normal. A distant cabin light, a campfire, something human and inexplicable. But as we got closer, I realized this light was different. It was moving, not wildly, not erratically, but with a purposeful, intelligent motion that made my stomach twist. The light was pale and greenish, like some kind of phosphorescence, and it was hovering maybe 300 yards ahead of us, just above the tree line. Marcus called it in on the radio, reported the light. The dispatcher back at base camp responded with confusion. No other teams were in the area. No aircraft had been reported. No hikers with flares. The light simply shouldn't exist. But it did, and it was moving deeper into the wilderness, moving in a direction that didn't make sense for anyone looking to be found. I made the decision to follow it. This might have been the worst decision of my life, but at the time it seemed logical. The light had to have a source. A source meant there was someone out there in this terrifying darkness who might need help. Or who might be Sarah Mitchell, signaling us. We followed. For the first mile, the light stayed ahead of us, maintaining a steady distance. Impossible distance, actually. We were moving fast, practically running through the snow and dark. And the light wasn't getting any closer. It was like it was drawing us deeper into the park, deeper into the eerie silence and the kind of cold that stops human thought. That's when I noticed something creepy about the light. It had no glow. Normal light spreads, illuminates the area around it, creates a halo. This light was contained. It was like a solid object, a sphere of illumination suspended in the darkness without affecting anything around it. Looking at it directly made my eyes water. Marcus was breathing hard beside me. He said something that made me realize I wasn't imagining the wrongness of what we were experiencing. He said the light was getting closer. Not moving toward us, but expanding. Like we were moving into it rather than it moving toward us. The temperature, which had been brutally cold, suddenly dropped further. My thermometer read 55 below. That shouldn't have been possible. The cold became something nightmare quality. Something that didn't belong in the physical world. It was the kind of cold that doesn't just numb you. It reaches into your mind and fills it with a specific kind of dread. We kept moving forward because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. That was probably part of the design. The light was hurting us. I understand that now. After what might have been 40 minutes or might have been hours, the forest around us changed. The trees became twisted, their branches reaching in unnatural angles. Some of them looked burned, but not from fire, from something else. The bark was blackened as if the wood itself had been poisoned. We were in a part of the park that shouldn't exist. I hiked these trails for 18 years and I'd never seen terrain like this. The light was directly above us now, maybe 200 feet up, hovering like something conscious and aware. Like it was observing us. That's when David screamed. Not in pain, but in a kind of terror so absolute that it bypassed all rational thought. He was pointing up at the light. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely keep his arm raised. Through his frozen breath and the chattering of his teeth, he managed to say that he could see something inside the light. A shape, a form, something that had geometry and intention. I looked up, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, I saw what he saw. A silhouette, human-shaped but wrong. The proportions were off. The limbs were too long. The head was at an angle that no living human could achieve. And it was watching us. Then it was gone. The light remained, but whatever I glimpsed had vanished or hidden itself again. Marcus was shouting into the radio, but the dispatcher wasn't responding anymore. We were out of range, or something was blocking the signal. The disturbing realization hit me that we'd been led so far into the Denali wilderness that we lost contact with the outside world. We were alone, completely, utterly alone with the light and whatever haunted it. I made the decision to turn back. This wasn't the search and rescue operation anymore. This was a survival situation. The scariest part was that I could feel the light's resistance. As we turned around and started moving back toward the direction we'd come, the light moved too. It stayed directly above us. It was following us now, not leading us. The terrifying implication was undeniable. We weren't hunting. We were being hunted. We moved faster. David was crying, though his tears froze before they could run down his cheeks. Marcus had his rifle raised, which was pointless against something like this, but I understood the psychological need. We needed to believe we had some kind of weapon against the darkness and the eerie presence above us. For miles, that light pursued us. Every time we accelerated, it accelerated. Every time we changed direction, it anticipated our movement and repositioned itself overhead. It was playing with us. This was the horrifying realization. This thing in the sky, this nightmare quality entity, was capable of thought and strategy and the kind of cruel intelligence that comes from something ancient and predatory. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 hours, we saw the ranger station lights in the distance. Our base camp, civilization, other people. The light suddenly accelerated upward, rising so fast it vanished into the darkness above us in seconds. The moment it was gone, a weight lifted off my chest, and I could breathe again. I could think again. We stumbled into the station around midnight. The dispatcher took one look at us and called for medical attention. We were suffering from severe hypothermia, psychological shock, and something none of the doctors could quite identify. All three of us had strange marks on our bodies. Thin lines, like burns, in patterns that didn't correspond to any standard injury. The official report says we got lost in the darkness and suffered cold-induced hallucinations. Stress-related paranoia that created the illusion of a threatening light. This is what the Park Service wants to believe. This is what they told the public. But here, this is what they don't mention. Sarah Mitchell was found 3 days later, wandering near the Wonder Lake Trail. She was fine physically, hypothermic but stable, but she couldn't speak. She could walk, she could eat, she could perform basic functions, but she couldn't produce words. She couldn't communicate what happened to her out there in the darkness. The doctors called it a psychological break. Psychogenic mutism, a manifestation of trauma. I spent time with her in the hospital. I showed her pictures and asked her to point at things, trying to understand what she experienced. She was always calm, always present, until I showed her a picture of the night sky. Then she would start shaking. Her breathing would become rapid and shallow. Her eyes would fill with something that looked like recognition. She knew what the light was. She'd seen it. She experienced something out there in that nightmare-quality darkness that had broken her ability to process language itself. The most chilling part came 3 weeks later. I was back on patrol, trying to convince myself that everything was normal, that I was just doing my job, when I found something in the forest. In that area where the trees had looked burned and twisted. A location I marked on my map but which no longer appeared on the official park boundaries. There was an object there. At first, I thought it was a spacecraft or something mechanical. But it was organic. It looked like something that had grown from the ground itself, a structure made of matter that didn't correspond to anything in nature. It was warm to the touch despite the freezing temperature, and it was humming, a low frequency that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. I took pictures, documented the location with GPS coordinates. Then I ran. I tried to report what I found. The park superintendent dismissed it as some kind of geological formation, an unusual rock structure. When I pushed for a proper investigation, they became hostile. They suggested I was still experiencing the effects of my trauma in the darkness. They recommended I take a leave of absence. I left Denali 2 months ago. I haven't been back, but I haven't been able to forget what happened out there either. Last week, I received a letter from Marcus. He's still working as a ranger, though he transferred to a different park in Montana. His letter was brief. He wrote that the light found him again. Not in Alaska, in Montana. He was doing a routine patrol when he saw it in the sky above the forest. That same pale greenish glow. That same awful intelligence. He didn't approach it this time. He just reported it and left his position. He is looking for work outside of Park Services now. David went missing 2 months ago. He disappeared while hiking in the Cascade Range in Washington. The search teams found his equipment but not David. No body, no traces, just absence. The official report is that he probably fell and is still out there somewhere. I know better. I think the light took him. I think whatever intelligence controlled that terrifying phenomenon wanted something from him. Something it had glimpsed or touched when it pursued us in the Denali darkness. The real horror is this. I've been researching, digging through historical records and ranger accounts. There are documented cases going back decades of park rangers reporting strange lights in Denali. Phantom lights that appeared during search operations. Lights that seemed to follow rescue teams. Lights that weren't in official reports because they were deemed too disturbing, too inexplicable, too damaging to the reputation of the parks. One account from 1986 described a light that hovered over a ranger station for 3 hours. When it finally left, every compass in the station was pointing in the wrong direction. Some of them were pointing at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Like they were responding to a source of magnetism that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Another account from 2003 mentioned rangers who reported seeing the light and subsequently developing a condition where they would compulsively hike back into the same area, despite conscious knowledge that it was dangerous. They were drawn. The light had marked them somehow, put something in them that pulled them back toward whatever it was. They experienced this. I have dreams where I'm back in that darkness, and the light is waiting for me. I know I'm dreaming, but I can stop myself from walking toward it, from wanting to see again what exists inside that pale green glow. The terrifying part is the progression. A few weeks of dreams, then occasional waking moments where I think I see the light in my peripheral vision. Then the night last week when I looked out my window and saw it, clearly visible against the night sky, hovering just at the edge of the mountains near my home in Colorado. It is spreading. The light is manifesting in places far from Denali, and I think that it's because we carried something with us when we escaped. Some kind of resonance or connection. We opened a door, and now it is following us, finding us one by one. I don't know what this thing is, whether it is extraterrestrial, some kind of interdimensional entity, or something that has been alive in the Alaskan wilderness long before humans ever set foot in that desolate place. I only know that it is intelligent, that it hunts, and that it is capable of incredible patience. If you rereading this and you work in wilderness management, if you've seen strange lights during night operations, if they had missing person cases that don't to make logical sense, please listen. Don't to dismiss these encounters. Don't to file them away as hallucinations or atmospheric phenomena. Don't to pretend they didn't happen. Because whatever's out there in the darkness, whatever controls those phantom lights, it is learning. It is adapting. And it is slowly expanding beyond the boundaries of national parks into places where normal people live normal lives. The eerie truth is that we might already be surrounded by these lights and not even know it. They might be out there right now, observing, waiting, marking the ones of us who will eventually hear the call and walk out into the darkness. Last night, I heard David calling my name. Not through the phone, not in a dream. I heard it coming from the direction of the mountains. A voice that sounded almost human but carried frequencies that made my teeth ache. I didn't go toward it, but part of me wanted to. That is the scariest part of all. The light is patient, and I am running out of reasons to resist its call. Story 7. Utqiagvik. This polar night. The shadow figures. The sun hasn't risen in Utqiagvik for 32 days now. That means 32 more days of complete darkness before it finally comes back. 32 days of waiting in a town where people are disappearing, where shadow figures have been seen walking along the frozen coastline, where the police want to admit what is really happening. This is my confession. This is what I saw. I arrived at Utqiagvik, Alaska, known by most people as Barrow, on November 15th. The sun had just set for the last time that year. For the next 65 days, there would be no daylight. The Arctic polar night would take over, and this entire town would exist in complete and total darkness. I came here thinking I was researching climate change impacts on coastal communities. I came here thinking I was prepared for what polar darkness would be like. I was wrong about everything. The town sits at the northernmost point of Alaska, right on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. When I arrived, the temperature was already dropping toward 40 below zero. The streets were mostly empty. People were heading indoors, preparing for the long darkness. The locals I talked to were quiet about it, almost resigned, like they knew something was coming but didn't want to say it out loud. There was an unsettling tension in the air, a creeping dread that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I checked into the top of the World Hotel, one of only a few places that rent rooms to visitors in Utqiagvik. The hotel sits on the northern edge of town, overlooking the frozen Arctic Ocean. My room was on the second floor, a small box with a window that I learned very quickly I should keep covered. Because even though the sun wasn't rising, there was still enough ambient light in the sky during what I guess you could call daytime to see shapes moving out on the ice. The first night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed listening to the wind howl outside, a sound so loud and continuous that it was almost hypnotic. The hotel creaked and groaned around me, the building shifting in the extreme cold. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate. They moved past my door and then stopped. I waited for them to move again, but they didn't. Whoever was in that hallway was standing right outside my room, just waiting. I got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. That is when the fear started to settle into my bones. That unsettling, creeping fear that comes from knowing something is terribly wrong but not understanding what it is. The next morning, if you could call the twilight morning, I went to the local police station. I needed to report what I heard, or at least try to explain the unsettling feeling that had gripped me. The police station was a small building near the center of town. Inside, I found a tired-looking officer named Pete who seemed unsurprised by my arrival. He told me that the hotel often made strange noises in extreme cold. He suggested I get earplugs and try to sleep, But before I left, I asked him something. I asked about the disappearances. I did read something online before coming here, a vague reference to missing persons reports in Utqiagvik during the polar night. His expression changed immediately. The unsettling tone in his voice became noticeable as he explained, in very careful terms, that people sometimes got confused during the darkness. They went outside and got lost. It happened every winter. Nothing unusual, except his hands were shaking as he said it. The terrifying nervousness in his body language contradicted every word coming out of his mouth. I pushed him on it. I asked if there were police logs documenting these disappearances. He wouldn't answer. He just told me not to go outside after dark and to stay in my hotel room at night. He said it as if he was reading from a script, like he said it to other people, other visitors, many times before. That's when I realized there was a pattern here, a chilling pattern that went deeper than missing hikers or confused tourists. I spent the next 3 days researching. I went to the local library and asked about historical records. The librarian, an elderly woman named Sarah, looked at me carefully, like she was trying to decide whether I could handle the truth. Then she pulled out a folder. Inside were police logs, some dating back decades. The logs documented disappearances during every polar night, stretching back to at least the 1960s. The disappearances followed an eerie pattern. They always started around day 30 or 35 of the polar night. That is when the reports began. People going missing. Most of them were people who went outside after dark. People who ventured toward the edges of town, toward the frozen ocean, toward the north where the horizon was barely visible even in the strange twilight. But here is what really made my skin crawl. A few of the disappearances involved people who never left their homes. People who vanished from locked rooms. People whose families found them missing from their beds in the morning, with windows still locked from the inside and no signs of forced entry. The scariest part came when I read the descriptions left by family members and witnesses. They all mentioned the same thing. Shadows. Shadow figures standing outside the windows. Shadow shapes moving along the streets. Dark silhouettes that seemed to have their own will, their own purpose, their own horrifying hunger. One account from 1988 described a family who claimed to see a shadow figure pressing its face against their window. The figure had no features. It was just darkness in the shape of something almost human. The father of the family had opened the door to confront it, and his family never saw him again. His body was never found. I asked Sarah if anyone had ever reported what these shadow figures actually were. She shook her head slowly. She said that people who had seen them up close, people who had made eye contact with them, they didn't come back. The ones who did come back were the ones who ran, the ones who refused to look directly at the shadows, the ones who made it back indoors before the figures could reach them. Then Sarah said something that chilled me to my core. She said that according to police logs, the disappearances stopped at a specific point every year. They stopped when the sun returned, when the polar night ended, when daylight came back to Utqiagvik. But they never lasted longer than the darkness. It was like the shadow figures could only exist in the absence of light. That night, I made a terrible decision. I decided to go outside and see if I could find one of these shadow figures for myself. I know how stupid that sounds. I know I should have stayed in my room, locked the door, and waited for the sun. But the need to understand, to verify, to solve the mystery was stronger than my sense of self-preservation. I dressed in heavy winter clothes and ventured out into the darkness. The cold was so intense it felt like knives cutting through the fabric. My breath froze immediately, creating clouds of ice that hung in the stillness. The eerie darkness was broken only by the faint light pollution from the town, creating strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. I walked toward the northern edge of town, toward the Arctic Ocean. The houses began to thin out. The streets became emptier. My footsteps on the frozen ground sounded loud and harsh in the silence. The creeping sense of dread grew with every step. Something inside me was screaming to turn back, but I kept going. That is when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows on the ice, shapes that could have been anything, rocks or ice formations or tricks of the light. But as I watched, the shadows began to move. They moved in a way that didn't match anything natural. They moved with intention, with purpose, with a horrible, disturbing awareness of their own movement. There were 3 of them, 3 dark shapes, roughly human in form but somehow wrong. The proportions were off. The way they moved was too fluid, too unnatural. And they were moving toward me. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I just ran, my legs pumping through the snow. my lungs burning in the extreme cold, the terror driving me forward like nothing I had ever experienced before. I could hear something behind me. Not footsteps, but a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. I made it back to the hotel and locked myself in my room. I was shaking, partly from the cold, partly from absolute fear. I sat on my bed and tried to calm down, but my mind was racing. I had seen them. The shadow figures were real. They existed, and they had been coming toward me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room with all the lights on, watching the window, waiting to see if the shadow figures would appear. They didn't. But I could hear something. A scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across the window pane. A tapping, rhythmic and patient. The terrifying sound of something that knew I was in here and was willing to wait. The next morning, I went back to the police station. I demanded to speak to the chief. Pete tried to stop me, but I pushed past him. In a back office, I found a man named Chief Morrison. He was an older man, hardened by years of dealing with things that didn't to make sense, things that couldn't to be easily explained or solved. I told him what I had seen. I told him about the shadow figures, about how they had been chasing me, about the scratching at my window. Chief Morrison listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he did something that scared me even more than the shadow figures had. He told me the truth. The shadow figures weren't, they weren't caused by the darkness. They had been coming to Utqiagvik for much longer than the town had existed. The indigenous people who lived here before the modern settlement called them by a name that meant the ones who hunt during the long dark. According to old stories, they came from the north, from somewhere beyond the ice, from a place that was even darker and colder than the Arctic night. The chief explained that over the years, they had learned certain things. The shadow figures couldn't enter buildings easily. They could scratch and tap, but they couldn't break through. They were weakened by artificial light. They fed on something in the human body, something that couldn't be identified, but that left the victim, his body looking drained and empty, like all the life had been sucked out of it. And here is the most horrifying part. The number of disappearances had been increasing. Where there used to be 1 or 2 missing people during each polar night, now there were 5 or 6. The pattern was accelerating, and according to the chief, no one knew why. Chief Morrison said something that I'll never forget. He said that the shadow figures seemed to be getting stronger, or perhaps the humans were getting weaker. Either way, there was a balance shifting, something changing in the way these creatures interacted with the town. And this year, everyone could feel it. The unsettling atmosphere, the tension, the creeping dread. It was all building toward something. He told me to stay inside. He told me not to go out after the twilight faded. He told me that if the shadow figures came to my window, I should not look at them directly. He said that the ones who made eye contact with the figures didn't survive. I spent the next week locked in my hotel room. I ordered food delivery. I didn't venture outside except when absolutely necessary. I watched the police logs online, refreshing every hour to see if anyone else had gone missing. 3 people disappeared that week. A man who went to his car for his medication. A woman who stepped outside to get firewood. A teenager who was found with the window of his bedroom wide open, the glass somehow broken from the inside out. On day 42 of the polar night, something changed. The scratching at my window stopped. The tapping stopped. The unsettling feeling that had gripped me began to fade. At first, I thought maybe the shadow figures had moved on. Maybe they had found other prey. But then I realized something terrifying. They were no longer interested in my window, because I could see them more clearly now, even without looking directly at them. I could sense their presence all around the building, moving through the hallways, descending the stairs. They weren't outside anymore. They had come inside. I could hear other guests screaming. I could hear the unsettling sounds of the figures moving through the hotel, the horrible sounds of something hunting in the darkness. I barricaded my door and turned on every light I had. I sat in the corner of my room and waited. The figure appeared at my window. It was so close I could almost see its features. The horrifying realization dawned on me that it had found a way to get closer, to press itself against the glass, to make itself visible to me in a way that would drive me crazy. But I didn't look at it. I remembered what the chief had said. Eye contact meant death. The figure tapped at the window pane. A slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was trying to get my attention, trying to make me look, trying to establish that chilling connection that would be my undoing. But I refused. I kept my eyes fixed on the wall. I didn't move. I didn't breathe if I could help it. Eventually, the figure moved on. I could hear it leaving, moving back down the hallway, drawn to other lights, other prey. When the sun finally returned on day 65, on that glorious morning when the sun broke over the horizon for the first time, the shadow figures were gone. They vanished with the return of light, dissolving into the air like they had never existed. The survivors emerged from their homes. The police stopped investigating. The hospital filled with people who had been attacked but managed to survive. I left Utqiagvik on the first available flight. I haven't been back, and I have no intention of ever returning. But I think about it constantly. I think about those shadow figures, about what they are, about where they come from. And I'm terrified by a realization that haunts me every single day. The polar night in Utqiagvik lasts 65 days. But there are other places on Earth where the darkness lasts longer. Much longer. I've been researching, and I found something unsettling. In some areas of the Arctic, the polar night lasts over 100 days. Some places are dark for nearly half the year. And according to my research, places like Svalbard and Tromsø in Norway have documented disappearances that follow a similar pattern. Indigenous stories from those regions speak of shadow figures during the long darkness. The same creatures, the same horrifying fate. I've also discovered something that chills me to my core. The shadow figures are spreading. Their hunting grounds are expanding. They are no longer confined to the most remote Arctic locations. There have been reports of similar disappearances in places like northern Canada, Greenland, and even northern Scandinavia. It's like they re-expanding their territory, like they retesting new hunting grounds, preparing for something. And here, it's what keeps me awake at night. They calculated the darkness patterns for different latitudes, and they realized that these creatures need darkness to survive. But as climate change continues to shift global weather patterns, the polar night is changing too. It is starting earlier. It's lasting longer. In some places, it is becoming more predictable and more intense. The shadow figures are going to have more time to hunt. They are going to have better conditions. And they are going to keep spreading south toward more populated areas, toward places where there are more people, more prey. The terrifying truth is that this might not be a localized phenomenon anymore. This might be the beginning of something much larger, something more horrifying. The darkness that once threatened only the remote Arctic is starting to extend its reach. And the things that live in that darkness are following. I hear scratching sounds sometimes now, even in Seattle where I live. I know it's probably just my imagination, just the trauma of what I experienced catching up with me. But late at night, when the sky is dark and the shadows are deep, I wonder if the shadow figures remember me. I wonder if they are still looking for me. I wonder how long the darkness can spread before it reaches places where I am living now. The sun will rise tomorrow. It always does, but every night when it sets, I hold my breath and count the hours until it returns. Because I learned something terrifying in Utqiagvik. When the darkness is deep enough, when it lasts long enough, something awakens in it. Something that hunts, something that feeds, something that gets stronger with every polar night. And I am terrified that one day, the darkness will last so long that the sun won't be able to chase it away. Story 8 to 1999 Nome. Silent night, mass hysteria. On December 22nd, 1999, at precisely 9:47 in the evening, every telephone in Nome, Alaska rang at the same exact moment. And when I answered, I heard a sound that I can only describe as the audio recording of a human being slowly freezing to death in the darkness. And I knew immediately that something terrifying and inexplicable had just begun. The question I am asking you to answer in the comments is this: if you received a phone call that seemed to come from beyond death itself, from someone trapped in a place of absolute cold and darkness, would you try to help them, or would you hang up and pretend it never happened? My name is Catherine Simmons, and I am 61 years old. I am a registered nurse who has lived in Nome for 38 years. I came to Alaska as a young woman, seeking adventure and escape from a suffocating life in the lower 48. I found both, and I stayed. I built a life here. I raised my children here. I became part of the fabric of this small, isolated community that sits on the edge of the Bering Sea, where the darkness lasts for months and the cold is so severe that exposed skin freezes in minutes. I thought I understood danger. I thought I understood isolation. I thought I understood the terrible power of nature to break people. But nothing in my experience, nothing in my education, nothing in the accumulated wisdom I had gathered over nearly 4 decades in Alaska prepared me for what happened on that night. December 22nd was supposed to be an ordinary evening. The blizzard had been building all day, and by evening it had reached the point where visibility was nearly zero. The wind was screaming across the town with a sound like a living thing, rattling windows and shaking houses. The temperature was dropping steadily, already well below -30, and the wind chill was making it feel like we were living in some kind of frozen hell. I was at home, preparing for the holiday. I had baked cookies, I had wrapped presents, I was listening to Christmas music on the radio, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy and festive cheer despite the apocalyptic weather outside. My husband, Robert, was reading in the living room. My adult daughter, Emma, had called earlier to say that she was staying with friends on the other side of town and would wait out the storm there rather than risk driving home. At 9:47, the phone started ringing. I know the exact time because I remember looking at the clock and noting that it was unusual for the phone to ring during a blizzard of this magnitude. Phone lines often went down in severe weather, but our phone was ringing, and so was Robert's in the other room. And as I would later discover, every single telephone in Nome was ringing at that exact moment. I picked up the handset and I heard breathing. Heavy, labored breathing. The kind of breathing that someone makes when they are in extreme physical distress. The kind of breathing that a person makes when their body is struggling to function in conditions that are pushing it beyond its limits. And underneath the breathing, I heard the wind. Not the wind outside my house. A different wind. A wind that sounded like it was blowing across a vast, frozen emptiness. A wind that carried with it the sound of absolute cold and isolation. I asked who was calling. I asked who was on the line. I asked them to identify themselves. They didn't respond. They just continued to breathe, the sound becoming more and more strained, more and more desperate, more and more frightened. And then I heard something else, a sound like teeth chattering. Uncontrollable, violent chattering. The chattering of someone whose core body temperature had dropped so dangerously low that their body was reflexively trying to generate warmth by contracting their muscles. I realized, with a cold certainty that made my own blood run cold, that I was listening to someone who was in the process of freezing to death. I tried to offer help. I asked them where they were. I asked them what had happened. I asked them what I could do to help them survive this nightmare. But they couldn't respond. They could only breathe and shiver and make these terrible sounds of a human body slowly surrendering to the cold. The call lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then the line went dead. There was no disconnection sound. No static, just the abrupt cessation of the breathing and the wind and the chattering teeth. Robert came rushing into the kitchen, his face pale. He had also received a call. He had also heard the same sounds, the sounds of someone freezing to death in a blizzard. He asked me if I thought it was some kind of prank. I told him I didn't know, but that if it was the most disturbing and elaborate prank I had ever experienced. Within minutes, our phone began to ring again. This time, I didn't recognize the voice on the other end, but I knew the sounds. The breathing, the wind, the chattering teeth, the sounds of someone in the final stages of hypothermia. We let it ring through and didn't answer the third time. But we could hear it ringing through the walls, could hear it ringing in the bedrooms, could hear it ringing even though the phone had been disconnected from the wall. That's when I realized something that filled me with absolute terror. Whatever was calling, it wasn't using the telephone network in any conventional way. It was calling from somewhere else. Somewhere cold, somewhere dark, somewhere that existed outside of the normal rules of communication and technology. Within an hour, the streets of Nome erupted into chaos. People emerged from their homes, confused and terrified. They had all received the calls. Every single person in town had picked up their phone and heard the sounds of someone freezing to death. Emergency services were overwhelmed with calls. People were reporting the same terrifying experience over and over. The police department was in complete confusion, trying to figure out what was happening, trying to understand how every phone in town could ring simultaneously with the same horrifying message. The hospital where I worked received dozens of patients who were having panic attacks, anxiety attacks, complete psychological breakdowns. I worked through the night with my colleagues, trying to help people who were experiencing a terror so profound that many of them couldn't even articulate what they had experienced. They just kept repeating the same phrase. I heard someone dying. I heard someone freezing to death. By morning, The blizzard had passed. The sun rose on a white, pristine landscape, utterly beautiful and utterly terrifying. But something had changed in Nome. Something fundamental had broken in the collective consciousness of the town. Throughout that first day after the event, which we had started calling Silent Night, because of the way the calls had come during the Christmas season and because of the eerie silence that had seemed to accompany them, people began to report that loved ones were missing. A total of 7 people had vanished from their homes during the night. They had simply disappeared. Their beds were empty. Their coats were gone. There was no sign of forced entry or struggle. They had simply walked out into the blizzard and never come back. The police launched search and rescue operations, but the blizzard had buried all traces. The snow had covered any footprints. The wind had erased any evidence of direction. By the time the rescue teams could get organized and mobilized, the missing people had been out in -50-degree temperatures for hours. The chances of finding them alive were essentially zero. But that wasn't the strangest part. 3 of the missing people were found within a week, wandering on the outskirts of town, completely unaware of how much time had passed. They had no memory of the previous 6 days. They didn't understand why they were outside in the snow. They couldn't explain how they had survived the blizzard without proper clothing or shelter. Medically, it made no sense. Their body temperatures should have been so low that they should have been dead. Their frostbite should have been so severe that they should have required amputation. But they seemed almost unharmed, as though they had been preserved in the cold like specimens in a freezer. And when we questioned them about their memories, about what they had experienced during those missing days, they described something that was absolutely horrifying. They described standing in a white landscape of endless snow and ice, completely alone, hearing a sound like wind but also like voices, hearing sounds that they couldn't identify coming from beneath the ice. They described a sensation of being observed by something that they couldn't see. They described a terrible, creeping cold that seemed to come not just from the air but from inside their own bodies, as though something cold and foreign was living inside them. And they described seeing other people, shadowy figures in the distance, people who seemed to be walking in specific directions with obvious purpose. People who seemed to be heading towards something, or towards somewhere, though my 3 colleagues couldn't articulate where. The other 4 missing people were never found. The search and rescue teams eventually had to call off the operation. Winter in Alaska waits for no one, and the cold and the darkness were closing in again. Over the following months, something unsettling began to happen in Nome. More people reported hearing sounds at night. Sounds like someone moving in their houses. Sounds like someone walking upstairs or moving through hallways. And some people reported hearing sounds that resembled the freezing sounds from the original phone calls. Sounds of someone in extreme cold and distress, coming from inside their own homes. Psychological problems began to proliferate. Depression deepened. Anxiety disorders became epidemic. The suicide rate in Nome spiked significantly. People began leaving town, saying they couldn't bear to stay any longer, saying they felt watched, saying they felt pursued by something that they couldn't escape. And then the disappearances started again. Every few weeks, another person would vanish, always during heavy snow or blizzard conditions, always leaving behind no explanation and no trace, always leaving behind people who were desperate to understand what was happening but completely unable to find answers. I became obsessed with understanding the phenomenon. I began to research the history of Nome. I began to look for similar events in historical records, and what I discovered was absolutely chilling. In 1925, there had been a similar incident. Multiple people reported hearing telephone calls during a blizzard. Multiple people reported hearing the sounds of someone freezing to death. And within a week, 17 people had gone missing from Nome. They were never found. In 1952, the same thing happened again. Telephone calls during a blizzard. The sounds of freezing and death. Missing people disappeared into the darkness and the cold. And in 1976, it happened once more. I began to understand that this was not a random event. This was not a psychological phenomenon or mass hysteria. This was something that happened in Nome with a certain periodicity. Something that was connected to the blizzards and the cold. Something that was ancient and intelligent and that seemed to be actively hunting people in my town. I reached out to researchers at the University of Alaska. I shared my findings with them, and what they told me confirmed my worst fears. They said that Nome sits on a geographic location that has a long history of strange phenomena. They said that indigenous people in the region had oral traditions about something that lived in the frozen darkness. Something that called to people during blizzards. Something that drew people out into the cold and took them somewhere. The researchers said they believed the phenomenon might be related to a form of mass psychogenic illness, but that there were elements that didn't fit that explanation. They told me that some of the research suggested that there might be something in the permafrost itself, something preserved in the ice for thousands of years, something that might be capable of affecting human consciousness and behavior in ways that we didn't fully understand. I realized then what was happening. The calls during Silent Night weren't coming from people freezing to death. They were coming from something else, something that understood human suffering and human fear well enough to replicate it, something that was using those calls as a lure, as a way to draw people out into the cold, as a way to take them somewhere. And I understood something even more terrifying. The 4 people who had disappeared and not returned weren't dead. They were somewhere else. They were somewhere in the frozen darkness, doing something, existing in some state that I couldn't comprehend. The 3 who had come back had been allowed to return. They had been released for some reason that I couldn't fathom. Perhaps they had served whatever purpose the thing in the ice had intended. Perhaps they had been rejected for some reason. But their presence in town, their descriptions of what they had experienced, seemed to be drawing more people into the same fate. Over the following years, the disappearances in Nome continued, not frequently enough to cause constant alarm, but consistently enough to maintain a background level of dread and fear in the community. People began to leave. The population of Nome started to decline. Businesses closed. Schools lost students. The town seemed to be slowly dying, being drained of its people by something that lived beneath the ice and in the darkness. I never left. I stayed in Nome because I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to help the people who remained. I needed to try to figure out why this was occurring and whether there was any way to stop it. And I discovered something that changed everything. The disappearances seemed to target people who are sensitive to the phenomenon. People who have heard the calls clearly. People who have experienced the phenomenon most intensely. These are the people who eventually disappear. It is as though whatever is calling is collecting people who can perceive it, people who have some kind of sensitivity to its presence. I have heard the calls. I have heard them on multiple occasions. And I know that eventually, during some future blizzard, I will walk out into the cold and the darkness. And I want to come back. That is not resignation. That is not acceptance. That is simply understanding how this works. The thing in the ice is patient. It hunts across decades. It takes its time. It waits for the right moment, the right blizzard, the right convergence of circumstances. And when that moment comes, when I hear that terrible sound of someone freezing to death, I know that I want to be able to resist. I know that I will walk toward it. I know that I will follow it into the darkness and the cold, just like the others have done. The real horror of Silent Night is not the immediate terror of the event itself. The real horror is the slow, creeping realization that something ancient and patient lies beneath this town, that it feeds on human life and human consciousness, and that there is absolutely nothing we can do to stop it. We can run, but it will find us somewhere else. We can hide, but the calls will reach us wherever we go. We can organize, we can fight, we can try to protect ourselves with science and reason, but none of it will matter. Because whatever is in the ice has been patient for thousands of years. And it can wait for us. It can wait for as long as it needs to. It has all the time in the world. My final question for you is this. If you knew that something ancient and intelligent was slowly hunting the people in your town, that it took people deliberately and methodically, and that there was no way to escape or stop it, would you stay and try to fight it? Or would you abandon your home and everyone you care about to save your own life? Tell me in the comments what you would do. Story 9. Denali Night Watch. Lights that errant. 2 planes. I've watched something impossible hover over Denali for 3 years, and nobody believes me because I can't explain what it is. That is the terrifying part. Not the strangeness, not even the fear. It is the certainty that something is genuinely wrong, and the absolute inability to prove it to anyone else. My name is James, and I am a pilot. I've logged over 8,000 hours of flight time across Alaska. I know the sky. I know the weather patterns. I know every plane that flies through this airspace. And I know what is real and what is atmospheric illusion. Which is exactly why what I've been seeing keeps me awake at night. It started in the fall of 2021. I was working for a bush plane service that runs freight and personnel between Anchorage and the smaller settlements in the interior. The work is steady, the pay is decent, and the views of Denali, the mountain that the native people call the Great One, are breathtaking. Or they were before the lights started. I first noticed them on a clear night in September. I was returning from Fairbanks to Anchorage, flying alone, cruising at 8,000 feet. The mountain was visible beneath me, its peak catching the last light of the setting sun, even though the ground below was already dark. The sky was clear and starry, the kind of perfect visibility that made flying feel like pure freedom. That is when I saw the lights. They were above the summit of Denali, hovering in a formation that made no logical sense. There were 5 of them, arranged in a perfect pentagon shape, each one pulsing with a soft, eerie blue-green glow. Not the white or red lights of any aircraft I've ever seen. Not the cold green of Aurora Borealis, which I know intimately after thousands of hours in Alaskan skies. Something different, something wrong. I reported it immediately to Anchorage Center. The controller on duty said they had no radar contact with any aircraft in that area. No commercial flights, no military operations, nothing at all. I watched the lights for approximately 3 minutes. Then they simply vanished, as if someone had switched them off. The sky was empty. The mountain stood alone again, just a dark shape against the stars. I landed in Anchorage shaken but logical. There had to be an explanation. Reflections off ice on the peak. Reflections off my windscreen combined with some kind of aurora activity. A hallucination brought on by fatigue. I had been flying for 14 hours that day. My mind could have been playing tricks. Except I knew better. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't normal. The second occurrence came 3 weeks later. This time, I wasn't alone. I was flying with my co-pilot, a young guy named Derek who had only been with the service for 6 months. We were heading north toward Fairbanks on another clear night. The mountain was visible again, that familiar dark giant rising into the starlit sky. The lights appeared without warning. This time there were more of them, maybe 8 or 9, arranged in a loose spiral pattern that seemed to rotate slowly around the peak. The same blue-green glow, the same unsettling wrongness. And as we watched, the formation began to move. Not erratically, deliberately, smoothly, like something with intelligence and purpose. Derek saw it too. His hands gripped the controls so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't say anything. He just stared. The lights maintained a distance of maybe 5 miles from our aircraft. They didn't approach us. They didn't seem to acknowledge us. They just continued their slow, deliberate movement around the mountain peak, that eerie glow pulsing in a rhythm that almost seemed organic. Then Derek turned the plane slightly to get a better look, and the lights immediately vanished. Complete darkness, as if they had never existed. I reported it again. Anchorage Center still had no radar contact. No other pilots in the area reported seeing anything. It was just the 2 of us, and we both knew what we had witnessed. And we both knew that nobody would believe us without corroboration from the official aviation systems. That is when I started researching. I dug into the archives. I called old-timers who had been flying Alaska skies for decades. I spoke with park rangers who worked around Denali National Park, and I discovered that I wasn't the only one seeing these lights. There were dozens of reports, maybe hundreds, dating back decades, some of them going back to the 1950s. The military had investigated in the 60s and 70s. They called it Project Blue Book, and they concluded that most UFO sightings were either misidentifications of conventional aircraft or natural phenomena. But the Denali reports were different. The military file on Denali lights was sparse, heavily redacted, and marked as inconclusive. More disturbing were the native accounts. The Athabascan people who lived in the region for thousands of years before European contact had stories about the mountain. Stories about lights that danced above the peak. Stories about beings that existed between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. The stories described the lights as terrifying, malevolent, things that tested the boundaries of reality itself. One of the rangers I spoke with was a man named Robert who was part Athabascan, part white. He had grown up hearing the old stories, and he had also spent 20 years monitoring the mountain from the ground. My grandmother warned me about the lights, Robert said when I met with him at the ranger station in Tahkeetna. She told me they had been watching the mountain forever, that they came from outside, from spaces that human beings aren't supposed to see. She said they were hunting. Hunting what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Anything that gets too close to the peak, Robert said. Anything that tries to understand them. She said the lights test you. They see if you are strong enough or smart enough or aware enough to be allowed to see them and live. Most people most people go crazy. I tried to dismiss this as folklore, but the chilling words stuck with me. Over the next 6 months, I saw the lights 17 more times. Each encounter was different. Sometimes they were blue-green. Sometimes they shifted through colors I didn't have names for. Sometimes they moved in rigid geometric patterns. Sometimes they seemed to dance and swirl with something that looked almost playful, which was somehow more terrifying than if they had been aggressive. Other pilots started seeing them too. We never spoke about it in official channels because we knew how we would sound. But there was a network of us, a handful of bush pilots who had witnessed something genuinely unexplainable. We started trading notes, comparing timestamps, trying to find patterns. One thing we discovered was disturbing. Every person who saw the lights more than once started experiencing other strange phenomena. Instruments would malfunction. Radios would pick up signals that weren't coming from any known source. And there were dreams, terrifying, vivid nightmares about the mountain and the lights and something vast and intelligent observing you from just beyond the edge of perception. Derek quit flying 6 months after his sighting. He took a job in Seattle working for a software company. He told me he couldn't do it anymore. He said the dreams were getting worse. He said he felt like something was watching him, even when he was on the ground, even when he was thousands of miles away from Alaska. A month before he quit, he told me about something that had happened to him. He had been flying near the mountain during the day, and his instruments suddenly went haywire. The altitude indicator spun like it was broken. The compass pointed in 2 different directions simultaneously. His radio filled with static, and underneath the static, he could swear he heard voices. Not speaking English or any language he recognized, just rhythmic sounds that felt almost linguistic, almost like they were trying to communicate. Derek managed to stabilize the plane and fly away from the area, but something had fundamentally changed for him. He told me that he felt like the lights had marked him, like they knew him now, like they would always be watching, no matter where he went. I understand that feeling now because I am experiencing it too. The encounters have become more frequent. I'm seeing the lights almost every time I fly near Denali, even during the day when they shouldn't be visible. But I see them anyway. A shimmer in the air, a distortion in the sky, a feeling of presence above the mountain. And the dreams have started. I dream about standing on the summit of Denali. The sky around me is filled with lights, all of them rotating and pulsing and moving in patterns that seem to follow some kind of mathematical logic. And I understand, somehow, that I am not alone on the peak. There's something there with me, something large and intelligent and profoundly alien, and it is trying to communicate with me. When I wake up, I can almost remember what it was trying to say, but the meaning evaporates as consciousness returns. All that remains is the horrible certainty that it was trying to teach me something, to show me something, to prepare me for something. The other pilots and I have noticed something else that is eerie and deeply disturbing. The sightings seem to be increasing in intensity and frequency. The lights are getting bolder. They re-venturing further from the peak. They reappearing during times when they shouldn't to be visible. And there have been disappearances. A ranger went missing in the park 3 months ago. His name was Christopher. He had reported seeing strange lights near Wonder Lake and said he wanted to investigate. They found his truck, but they never found him. The search and rescue operation was called off after 2 weeks. The official report said he had probably become disoriented in the wilderness and perished, but his body was never recovered. I knew Christopher. He had seen the lights. He had become obsessed with them, just like the rest of us. 2 weeks after Christopher disappeared, another pilot reported seeing the lights on the ground. Not in the sky, on the ground, moving across the tundra near where Christopher's truck was found. The lights were described as having an almost physical presence, leaving the ground disturbed in their wake. Last month, I was flying alone near the mountain when something happened that changed everything I thought I understood about what was happening. The lights appeared, and this time they did something new. They began to move toward my aircraft. Not aggressively, deliberately, methodically, like they were curious about me specifically. I tried to turn away, to fly in a different direction, but my instruments went dead. All of them. The engine was still running. I had control of the plane, but all the instruments that tell me where I am and what is happening were completely offline. The lights surrounded my aircraft. I could see them clearly now, just beyond the windscreen. They weren't vehicles. They weren't anything mechanical. They were almost organic, pulsing with that eerie light, and they seemed to have structure and substance, but not in any way that made logical sense to my brain. And I heard the voices. They were coming through the dead radio. They were in the static between stations. They were making sounds that seemed to be trying to form words, trying to communicate in a language that was almost familiar, almost English, but twisted and wrong. The lights held position around my aircraft for 47 seconds. I counted them. 47 seconds of the most intense fear I have ever experienced. Fear so profound that it felt like my mind was beginning to fracture under the weight of it. Then everything went dark. When my instruments came back online, I was over Anchorage, 50 miles from where the lights had surrounded me. Somehow, in the darkness and the fear, I had traveled 50 miles, but I had no memory of flying those 50 miles. No memory of the time at all. The flight log showed that I had been unconscious, or flying on autopilot, for over 2 hours. I can't explain it. I have no rational framework for understanding what happened to me during those missing 2 hours. Since that night, I haven't flown near Denali. I requested reassignment. I've taken leave from the bush plane service. I am trying to pretend that the lights don't exist, that the encounters weren't real, that my missing time was some kind of medical episode or stress-induced hallucination. But I know the truth, and the truth is creeping in around the edges of my normal life. I see them now even when I'm not flying. Lights in the corner of my vision, shapes that almost resolve into meaning and then slip away. I hear the voices in the static of my television and radio. I dream about the peak of Denali every single night. Last week, I received an email from Robert, the ranger. He said that more people had reported seeing the lights. And he said that his grandmother had come to him in a dream and warned him that the lights were preparing for something. That they had been testing us. That they had been learning how we think and how we perceive reality. And soon, she said, they would be ready to do more than just watch. Robert asked me if I wanted to go back to Denali, if I wanted to climb the mountain with him and try to reach the peak, to see if we could understand what the lights wanted. He said his grandmother had given him instructions for how to approach them, how to communicate with them, how to maybe, possibly, survive the encounter. I told him no. I said I never wanted to see those lights again. But I was lying, because the truth is, I want to go back. I want to climb that mountain. I want to stand on the summit and wait for the lights to appear. I want to finally understand what they were trying to tell me. I want the missing time to make sense. I want the dreams to stop and the answers to begin. And I am terrified that this desire I send coming from me, that it is being placed in my mind by something that exists in spaces I can perceive. That I am being called to the mountain, just like Christopher was called. Just like every person who has ever seen the lights has been called. The Great One watches over Denali. That is what the native people said. Not a god, not a spirit, something that exists between realities. Something that has been observing humanity from the peak of that impossible mountain for longer than we have records. And now it is watching me specifically. I can feel its gaze. It follows me everywhere. It whispers in the static. It appears in the corner of my vision. It is patient and methodical and infinitely intelligent. The chilling truth that keeps me awake at night is this. I'm going back to Denali. Maybe not today, maybe not this month, but someday soon, I'm going to book a flight to Tahiti. I'm going to meet Robert, and I'm going to climb to the peak of that mountain to finally understand what the lights want. And I know with absolute certainty that I want to come back the same person, because people dawn. People who see the lights and understand them dawn to return to normal human existence. They become something else, something changed. Something that understands things about reality that human minds were never meant to comprehend. Derek felt it. Christopher couldn't resist it. The pilots and rangers and climbers who have seen the lights across the decades have all eventually felt the same pull. And now I feel it too. So if you flying over Alaska and you see those strange lights hovering above Denali, if you witness that eerie blue-green glow pulsing above the peak, my advice is simple. Dawn, to look at them. Dawn, to try to understand them. Dawn, let them mark you the way they marked all of us. Because once they have your attention, they never let go. And soon, they'll be receiving the same call that I am receiving right now. The call to climb the mountain. The call to meet whatever intelligent, terrifying presence waits at the summit of the Great One. The call to become something other than human. And you'll answer, just like we all do. Because the alternative is to spend the rest of your life knowing that something vast and incomprehensible is watching you from beyond the edge of reality. And that knowledge is a kind of horror that no mind was ever meant to carry.